Hello and welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. Off to a great start, accidentally playing the IDP music to begin with. But we had a great Week 14. Happy National Tight End Day to those who celebrate it. It was an interesting day in the NFL this week. Had the recap to all 14 games like I usually do. There wasn't that much to do with running backs, but there is a lot to do with wide receivers. With the three trades that happened, a lot of guys or a lot of teams adjusting to their new players or adjusting to not having a player. A lot of wide receiver injuries that even if it's a third or fourth player down the depth chart, the teams are still adjusting how they're using their top wide receivers in order to best utilize the players that they have. So definitely a lot of interesting things at wide receiver this week. So with the top 5 recap that I'll go through today. Going to skip over running backs altogether. If you want anything on running backs, I do have that in the recap, but we are going to jump straight to wide receivers. Starting with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we knew that it would be an interesting time for the Buccaneers wide receivers. Mike Evans suffered an injury that will keep him out at least for a couple of weeks, and Chris Godwin suffered a season-ending injury, so Tampa Bay had to dig deeper down the depth chart. First off, their replacement for Mike Evans was Trey Palmer, just as we expected, just what we saw last week in their game. Mike Evans, a clear X receiver for Tampa Bay for the past decade, and Palmer kind of filled that role as the X receiver. The main difference is, one, he didn't see nearly as many targets as Mike Evans was consistently seeing, and two, they rotated him out a little bit more than they would typically rotate Mike Evans out. Raheem Jarrett, who was an undrafted player, missed a lot of time last season and then was on injured reserve, activated for injured reserve before this game. He was the backup X receiver, and he had a couple nice plays in this game, caught 3 passes for over 50 yards. I would not be at all surprised if we see Jarrett and Palmer split playing time a little bit more next week with how well Jarrett played. But then the really interesting thing was what they did at the Z receiver and slot receiver. Since that's what will be the thing impacting wide receivers over the entire season. We had thought that there was a chance Shepard would be the primary slot receiver for Tampa Bay, but really it was Sterling Shepard who was the slot receiver. Shepard took over that role in a couple of snaps to end last week, so this wasn't entirely surprising, but it was really Shepard seeing that significantly different role than what he had been seeing earlier in the season in Tampa Bay. Shepard, in his time with the Giants, had significant experience in the slot as well as out wide, and McMillan also playing significantly in the slot in his time in college. So it would make sense for either one of them to be playing in the slot, but it looks like Shepard is going to be that guy going forward. It's still time for Tampa Bay to change what they're doing. They have their bye week coming up in a week or two, so maybe we start seeing the Tampa Bay shifting what they do. But for now, it looks like Shepard is going to be getting a lot of those high-value Godwin targets. But we did see McMillan in general see a higher target share than usual. It's still entirely possible that McMillan can be a fantasy-relevant wide receiver over the rest of the weeks just because he has less competition for targets than he was seeing earlier in the season. And then last note there, it wasn't even McMillan taking an every down role and Shepard taking all the snaps in the slot. We did see Ryan Miller, who was another undrafted Buccaneers wide receiver from last year. Throughout the preseason, he played significantly in the slot. Miller was getting a lot of work in this game as well. 5 targets, so second most among the Buccaneers wide receivers. So it might not even be Shepard completely getting this role. It could be a rotation with Miller. It might also just not be completely settled. This was just one game after the injuries, and there is time for Tampa Bay to change what they're doing. And then the last note, Cade Otton, 10 targets in this game. He had spent the last month as one of my top tight end waiver wire targets. He is playing very well and expect him to continue seeing a ton of targets with these wide receivers out. Next wide receiver situation I want to cover is the Kansas City Chiefs. We had seen them this past week trade for DeAndre Hopkins. And this was at a time where we know Rashee Rice is out for the season. We know Hollywood Brown probably out for the season. Very slight chance he comes back. And then specifically this week, they were in even more need for a wide receiver because Juju Smith-Schuster out with injury. Sky Moore recently placed on injured reserve. So they were getting pretty thin at their wide receiver depth. When they made the trade, I made the note on Twitter that I thought it was an interesting fit, just in that Hopkins throughout his career had been an X receiver for whichever team he was playing for, playing almost all the snaps out wide, still some snaps in the slot here and there. But the Chiefs haven't had a history of really throwing to X receivers, especially since Patrick Mahomes has become the quarterback. They are the team that has thrown the least targets to X receivers while throwing more to the other wide receiver positions, obviously throwing more to tight end Travis Kelce as well. So I was curious how the team envisioned using Hopkins. There were reports that he could see some of those snaps in the slot, which is the valuable Kansas City wide receiver position. We saw Tyreek Hill thrive in that role, playing both at the outside as a Z receiver as well as playing in the slot, and then Rashee Rice taking that role recently. This week, it was good to see that this week Hopkins really only played as an outside wide receiver. He only took 2 snaps in the slot, so it wasn't quite as much work for Hopkins as a lot of people expected. It was really Mecole Hardman who was playing that slot role, except Hardman was not playing on the outside in 2 receiver sets like we had seen other wide receivers do. So Justin Watson was basically their X receiver in this game. Xavier Worthy continued to line up all over the place. And then Hopkins not playing as much on the line of scrimmage as we're used to earlier in his career, but consistently playing on the outside. A lot of that work coming in 2 wide receiver sets. Still saw significant work in 3 wide receiver sets, was just the 3rd wide receiver in that group. So certainly time for Hopkins to earn more playing time going forward, but I'm not sure it'll necessarily happen in the slot. So I think Juju Smith-Schuster is pretty safe to continue seeing those slot snaps. And because of that, he could still be a fantasy relevant wide receiver. He could still be someone who sees a lot of targets. Certainly a chance Hopkins develops chemistry with Mahomes, earns a lot of targets, but there's also a chance that he is part of a rotation on the outside. Kansas City over these past couple years has used a heavy rotation of wide receivers with Justin Watson, Xavier Worthy being part of that rotation right now. Obviously, Worthy not seeing as much playing time as we're used to seeing, but saw a lot of targets in this game. So it'll be interesting to see how Kansas City uses their wide receivers going forward, and currently still using a lot of 2 tight end sets. Noah Gray on the field a lot, running a lot of routes in this game, running more routes than most of their wide receivers. So definitely will be interesting to see how the Chiefs wide receivers are used going forward. But I would probably be pretty reluctant to put Hopkins in my starting lineup, at least for these next couple weeks. And if he's not doing well after those few weeks, then there's a chance that he might not be a fantasy starter this season. That's also within the possibilities. It's possible that Hopkins just takes coverage away from all the other Kansas City receivers. Next wide receiver situation I want to cover tonight is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they had a rough stretch of luck with their wide receivers. Last week it was Tampa Bay losing their wide receivers. This week it was Jacksonville. Gabe Davis early in the game went down with an injury. I know he had been on the injury report the past couple weeks, but suffered a shoulder injury in this one. It was a knee injury that he was dealing with. So a different injury was early in the second quarter that he suffered this. So that kept him out for the rest of the game. I have not heard any reports about the extent of his injury, but definitely kept him out. After the injury happened, Parker Washington stepped up as the outside wide receiver in 3 wide receiver sets, and we saw Christian Kirk take more time in 2 wide receiver sets. Then late in the third quarter, it was Brian Thomas who went down with a chest injury. This led to Tim Jones seeing more playing time as the other outside receiver. And then not long after, Christian Kirk suffered an injury early in the fourth quarter. Reports are that he is going to be out for the rest of the season. He was someone that it was part of trade rumors, someone that could see more playing time going forward, but that did not end up being it's not going to be the case. He's not going to be traded at this point because they're not going to trade for a wide receiver who's out for the season. And once he went down with an injury, Jacksonville was out of wide receivers. They only have 5 wide receivers on the roster. So they used 12 personnel for the rest of the game, with Brenton Strange joining Evan Ingram as the 2 wide receivers consistently on pass plays. So Strange saw 5 targets in this one, played well again in this game. So going forward, I would expect Parker Washington, who was an outside wide receiver in this game, to take those slot snaps going forward, be the primary slot receiver for Jacksonville. We saw this last season when Kirk went down with an injury. So expect Washington to take that role. He was not someone who saw a lot of targets, so not someone I am particularly targeting in fantasy. What I do think is relevant fantasy-wise is Evan Ingram last season was averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game before the Kirk injury. The year before, averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game. This season, averaging 10.5 fantasy points per game. But once Kirk went down with the injury last year, that's when Ingram skyrocketed to 15 fantasy points per game, was one of the top couple of tight ends over the rest of the season. So I expect Ingram to take a bigger part of this offense going forward, see a lot of targets. And then even Brenton Strange, I wouldn't be surprised if they continue using a lot of 2 tight end sets. And Strange is a decent part of the offense. And if he's playing well, maybe he starts taking some of that snaps away from Ingram. But until then, I think the tight ends will be a major part of Jacksonville's offense going forward. Next wide receiver situation, or last wide receiver situation I want to cover today, is the Buffalo Bills, where Amari Cooper was only targeted twice and was the clear third wide receiver in this offense. They continue to use him a similar way to what they did last week in a rotation with Keon Coleman and Matt Collins. We saw Hollins see a significant decrease in snaps in this game, but Keon Coleman, after his good game last week, saw an increase in snaps, and Coleman followed that up with a good game this week. And then Curtis Samuel was out with injury, which allowed Khalil Shakir to play even more snaps in the slot, and he had a very good game with 9 targets, a lot of yards this week. So good game out of the Buffalo wide receivers in general. Dalton Kincaid, also someone who had a good game with 7 targets. The Bills tight ends have been interesting in that Kincaid, whenever they're winning games, he's not playing as much. So even though Kincaid's snap share was pretty low in this game, it was higher than what I had typically expected when the Bills were dominating games. So this was still a little bit nice to see out of Kincaid. But while everyone else was having a good game, Cooper only saw those 2 targets and was the clear third receiver. And this was happening throughout the game. It was happening early in the game before the game was out of reach. Even late in the game, Cooper was still playing a little bit with the wide receiver still rotating in and out. So at least for now, it was a step in the right direction for Cooper, but it was not a major step in the right direction. It wasn't quite what some people would expect for Cooper, considering he's been a starter throughout his career and playing 80, 90+% of offensive snaps. So we might not see that out of Cooper this year. So that's when I was doing my rest of season rankings, I really didn't move Cooper up very much because he had been a frustrating player in Cleveland with the quarterback situation. Now he might be a frustrating player in Buffalo with the rotation at wide receiver and the number of weapons that Buffalo already has at all of the skill position players. And if they're winning games like this, they might not need Cooper to do a whole lot. So Cooper is someone that I'd question whether I'm putting in fantasy starting lineups in future weeks. With it being National Tight End Day, I did have to save one tight end situation to talk about, and that is Dalton Schultz with the Houston Texans. And he had his best game of the season, but his playing time has been on a steady decline for the past month now. So that has not been great to see for Schultz. A big thing with him is Tegan Quatoriano. He was their run-blocking tight end at the beginning of last season, suffered an injury around week 8. So if you're watching and you see the graph on the screen, you can see around week 8, he saw a significant increase in playing time and was consistently playing over 75% of snaps over the rest of last season. Quatoriano suffered an injury in the Hall of Fame game this year, and that led the Texans to release him. Spent a little bit of time on the Bears practice squad, but was re-signed to the Texans 2 weeks ago. And he slowly started working in more in specifically 12 personnel and run blocking situations. But in the past, it had been Schultz and Cade Stover in 12 personnel. But now Quitoriano has slowly but surely taken all of those 12 personnel snaps. A week ago, it was 26 snaps total out of 12 personnel. 15 went to Schultz and 11 went to Quitoriano. This week, Quitoriano completely took over. Stover played 27 snaps, Quitoriano 21. Schultz only played 8 snaps and 12 personnel. And with how much the Texans like running the ball with Joe Mixon, they have been using more and more 12 personnel. And as someone mentioned in the chat, Diggs suffered an injury in this one on a non-contact play. And anytime there's an ankle injury on a non-contact play, that's not a great sign. So on one hand, that should hopefully mean to a higher target share from Schultz going forward, but that could also go with him playing fewer and fewer snaps, because if they have fewer wide receivers healthy, then they're going to use more 12 personnel, which means Schultz might not be on the field as much. And he was clearly playing less this game than he had been in a long time outside of week 12 last year when he suffered an injury, and then early last season when he was out a lot in run blocking situations. So even though Schultz's fantasy production in this game looked good and it made it look like he could be someone you want to add for your fantasy team, and especially with the Diggs injury, because Schultz is losing playing time on a weekly basis, because Houston likes running the ball so much, and in those run formations, he's not on the field as much, I am less optimistic about his future. There is one question that I want to cover before I sign off, and that is going into tomorrow night, Malik Neighbors or George Pickens at wide receiver. I would go with Neighbors. I think he's going to have the bigger game. I generally trust him in general going forward. I know Pickens had that big game last week with Russell Wilson, but Neighbors is just too good of a talent that I have him probably top 10 in my rankings every week going forward. So Neighbors is the wide receiver I would trust. But that covers it for the top 5 things that I wanted to cover. Obviously, a lot more happened today. A lot of interesting things at wide receiver, with players playing in the slot more or less often than usual, just depending on who was available. There were a couple running back situations. Obviously, the Cowboys tonight with Rico Dowdle not playing and then Dalvin Cook rotating in. The Browns were another interesting running back situation that I covered in my top 10 recap, as well as the New England Patriots. But really, if you go to my recap for all 32 teams, or I guess not all 32 because not Monday night and Thursday night football, but of the 28 teams, a lot of interesting things at wide receiver compared to running back this week. And even at tight end too, a couple of tight end situations evolving, the Atlanta Falcons being another one. So if you want to see that, the recap is up on the website right now. The most comprehensive recap you'll find anywhere, and also the first one that's up anywhere on any website each week in terms of fantasy football. So with that, as usual, this next week will be pretty normal for us from a content perspective. We'll have the waiver wire article up tomorrow morning. We'll have the Monday Night Football recap tomorrow night, and then my rest of season rankings, 5 to add, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, will be up on Tuesday, as well as my week 9 rankings will be up Tuesday afternoon, followed by start sit on Thursday, as well as the Thursday Night Football recap on Thursday for Halloween. And then a podcast schedule like usual. We expect John to be on with his IDP recap for tomorrow morning. John and I will be together for the Waiver Wire podcast on Tuesday. Will be a very interesting week off the waiver wire. Definitely some interesting quarterback and tight end options. And then probably the weakest running back waiver class that I can remember in a long time. Basically no one who you expect to be a fantasy starter available on the waiver wire, except for Tyrone Tracy and just over half of ESPN leagues. But we'll cover that in detail on Tuesday. And then John will again have his usual IDP episode later in the week, as well as John and Nick for the Start Sit podcast later in the week as well. So with that, I hope you enjoyed National Tight End Day. As always, if you want to go more into detail on not just the snaps for players and how they were utilized, but how well they played, the stats for the players, looking at players over time, you can get that with our premium stats with the PFF Plus subscription. The PFF Plus subscription is also how you would get access to my rankings, as well as all of my other non-recap articles. So with that, peace out.